In this video, we explore the Greek god of the underworld in order to clarify the likely nature of this deity and assess whether the factors shaping his image support or contradict the claim attributed to Socrates that people are excessively afraid of Hades. The god of the underworld does not possess a myth in which he serves as the central hero of a narrative. However, faint traces of such a role appear in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, where he is not only an active figure but also, for the first time in ancient literature, speaks with his own voice. This is particularly significant, as the god is not merely described but participates directly in the narrative through speech, as far as one can speak of independence among mythological characters. Although his words remain within the structure of the narrative, they are meaningful. They are spoken within the context of a marriage bed and addressed to Persephone. Notably, he does not speak to the dead or to other gods, which might otherwise be expected. Even in situations where direct speech could naturally occur, such as the episode involving the capture of Kerberos, his commands are instead conveyed indirectly by the narrator rather than expressed by the god himself. In this sense, they are attributed to him rather than performed. No other deity appears so consistently silent. Only a small number of myths feature him at all, and visual representations often provide more detailed accounts of these stories than literary sources do. Apart from the abduction of Persephone, the events in which he appears are linked to theogony, the myth of succession, and the capture of Kerberos. Even if additional stories once existed that might have further illuminated his elusive character, they have faded over time and are unlikely to be recovered. The abduction of Kerberos, the second most frequently depicted motif in Greek vase painting after the Eleusinian cycle among scenes involving Hades or Plouton, is also referred to several times in literary sources, most often by Heracles himself. The story, first attested by Homer in the Iliad, can be partially reconstructed from scattered references preserved by ancient authors. However, aside from the general reason for Heracles' descent into the realm of the dead, known as his 12th labor imposed by the Delphic oracle and carried out for Eurystheus, king of Mycenae, as punishment for killing his own children, the details of what occurred in the underworld cannot be fully restored. The surviving passages tend to describe, in a rather neutral manner, that Heracles removed the monstrous dog without difficulty. This lack of struggle in the transmitted versions appears somewhat surprising when considered alongside the hostile remarks of Aeacus in Frogs, which suggest lingering resentment after the abduction of Kerberos, as well as other encounters between the Lord of the Dead and Heracles. Among these is a striking episode recounted by Dion in the Iliad, where Hades is said to have been wounded at Pylus among the dead by an arrow shot by the hero. The weapon struck his shoulder and caused him great distress, forcing him to ascend to Olympus, where he was healed by Apollo. What stands out in this account is the emphasis on Hades' physical suffering, as he is portrayed as pierced with pain and grieving inwardly, while at the same time his immortality is clearly underlined by the statement that he was not mortal. The battle at Pylus, described as taking place among the dead, may have formed part of a broader mythological narrative concerning Heracles' attack on Elis. In this context, Hades, who was worshipped at Pylus in Elis, is said to have supported the Hellenes against the hero. According to later tradition, the inhabitants of Elis, in gratitude for his assistance, established a temple in his honor, likely situated in their marketplace. The sons of Kronos were three, as recorded by Hesiod, and were born in the following order: Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. Although the designation son of Kronos is most commonly associated with Zeus, it is also applied to all three brothers in literary sources. Several epithets attributed to Hades further confirm his place within this divine family. After the division of power among them, described in the Iliad, Hades received the shadowy realm as his domain. However, this dark region was not entirely separate, as Poseidon emphasizes that both the earth and Olympus remain shared by all three brothers. The final part of Poseidon's speech regarding this division may appear somewhat puzzling. On the one hand, the Iliad is the only source that explicitly states that the three brothers share authority over the earth and Olympus, which is usually considered the domain of Zeus. On the other hand, this idea seems to contradict the earlier claim that the cosmos had been divided among them. In reality, only those parts that could be separated were assigned individually, while the earth and Olympus necessarily remained common to all. The idea of equal division is reinforced by Poseidon's listing of arguments intended to justify his right to take part in the Trojan War. Even if his speech carries a tone of exaggeration shaped by anger, it draws attention to three essential elements: cult, origin, and sphere of activity. According to Poseidon, the brothers are equal in honor, which may suggest that they are equally significant, powerful, or worthy of worship. They assigned their shares by lot, emphasizing the fairness of the division. Since there is no single supreme ruler among them, they established their principal domains in a balanced and brotherly manner, while their status on Olympus, though somewhat unclear in later traditions, remains unchanged. This does not imply that they must constantly reside on Olympus. Apart from Zeus, they generally do not remain there, yet they retain equal rights to be present. This is illustrated, for example, by Hades ascending to Olympus after being wounded by Heracles, as well as by artistic depictions showing him among the other gods in assemblies without a specific mythological explanation. From another perspective, this arrangement may be understood through the idea that Olympus belongs to the earth, which is shared among them. The earth, as both their mother and grandmother, cannot be divided, and everything connected to it belongs equally to all three. Through this shared origin, they are united not only in authority but also in activity. Although their domains differ, each remains connected to and rooted in the earth. Later tradition assigns them clearly defined kingdoms, yet this distinction appears somewhat superficial. In practice, the division tends to develop along a dual structure, often leaving Poseidon less distinctly characterized. Ancient sources provide little detailed description of Poseidon's realm, while much more is said about the domains of Zeus and Hades, representing the worlds of the living and the dead. One possible explanation is that people are less inclined to imagine or describe a place they will never inhabit, such as the sea, whereas the underworld in Greek thought often appears as a reflection of the world of the living. Moreover, due to developments within the succession myth, Hades ultimately comes to possess more than his brothers, and more than might be expected from Poseidon's account of the division. Although it was never stated that the world was divided into strictly equal parts, everything in the sky, on the earth, and in the sea eventually comes under his authority, or more precisely, under that of his wife, whose role binds him even more closely to the realm of the living. The distinctive nature of Hades' domain is expressed in the idea that his dwelling lies beneath the surface of the earth. This is suggested in the Iliad, where Hades calls out to Poseidon, warning him not to shatter the earth's surface and reveal what lies hidden below. Similar expressions describe entering the house of Hades or going beneath the earth to his domain. This conception is made even clearer in funerary inscriptions, where the earth is directly associated with the underworld. The dead are described as lying hidden within the earth, covered and held by it, or received by it as honored among the chthonic gods. The close connection between the underworld and the earth is further emphasized by phrases indicating that the earth receives the dead into the realm of Hades. Frequent references also describe the dead as concealed or covered by the earth, which is consistent with the notion that the underworld exists within its depths. Some inscriptions go even further, stating that those who sprang from the earth return to it once again. Although many of these expressions are poetic in nature and rarely appear in prose, they point to an essential idea. The earth and the underworld were conceived as existing together, closely intertwined. As has been observed, the kingdom of the dead and the earth share a number of common features and qualities, which invites closer consideration of the actual location of the underworld. Its position may be inferred from the cosmic order described in the Iliad, where it appears to lie directly beneath the surface of the earth, effectively within the earth itself. According to the words of Zeus, at the point where the deepest abyss lies beneath the earth, there are iron gates and a bronze threshold, situated as far below Hades as the sky stands above the earth. In this framework, Tartarus emerges as a distinct region within the geography of the underworld, either positioned beneath it or related to it in the same way that the heavens relate to the earth. Tartarus and the sky thus form the two extreme limits of the cosmos, marking its lowest and highest points. Notably, both are described with similar materials, such as iron and bronze, which suggests a structural symmetry. This parallel indicates a mirroring between the world of the living and the world of the dead, reflected in both the organization of space and the defined depth at which Tartarus is located, first beneath the earth, and then at a distance from the underworld equal to that between the sky and the earth. From this perspective, the underworld is placed immediately below the earth's surface, with no intermediate space mentioned between them. Both the earth and the realm beneath it occupy, in a sense, the central position within the universe. A comparable description appears in Hesiod, who likewise situates Tartarus within the earth at a depth equal to the distance between the earth and the heavens. However, his account approaches spatial description differently. He first introduces the image of an anvil falling from the sky, emphasizing that the time it would take to fall from heaven to earth equals the time required to descend from the earth's surface to Tartarus, again highlighting the boundaries of the cosmos. Hesiod then shifts from a vertical to a horizontal perspective, describing the surroundings of Tartarus as a vast chasm enclosed by a bronze wall, with darkness layered around it in multiple circles. It is also described as lying at the furthest edge of the great earth. Above it extend the roots of both the earth and the barren sea, and in that same region are found the sources and limits of all things: the dark earth, the shadowy Tartarus, the sea, and the starry heavens. These are portrayed as successive and oppressive elements, even detested by the gods. In that place too stand the sorrowful dwellings of Hades and Persephone, guarded by a terrifying dog. Although this description does not provide a precise geographical location, it offers a sufficiently vivid structure of the underworld. Tartarus, or at least its boundaries, resembles the heavens in being composed of enduring materials such as bronze and iron. The symmetry between the upper and lower extremes of the cosmos is further reinforced by their equal distances from the Earth's surface. This suggests that what lies below can be understood as a reflection, even an image, of what lies above. If the world were inverted, it would appear essentially the same, except that Tartarus would form the upper boundary, and instead of clear air above the earth there would be the presence of dense night. In the passages describing the origin of the gods, Hesiod refers to the broad-breasted earth as the stable foundation of all immortals who dwell upon Olympus as well as in the depths of Tartarus. The earth's surface thus functions as the dividing line between these realms, while at the same time uniting them, since it belongs equally to all, as noted by Poseidon. From an early stage, the concept of the underworld is therefore embedded within the idea of the earth itself. This is also evident in early poetic accounts of the cosmos, where a threefold division into heaven, sea, and underworld does not appear. Consequently, the underworld, situated within the depths of the earth, represents Hades' portion of it. This connection becomes even clearer when his marriage to Kore and her cyclical return are interpreted symbolically, linking him to processes of growth and renewal emerging from the earth. When combined with the notion that the depths of the earth contain the sources and origins of all things, Kore can be understood as having made him, both symbolically and literally, a giver of riches. The narrative of what is perhaps the most significant myth connected to the god of the underworld, particularly in terms of its cultic meaning, centers on the abduction of Demeter's daughter and the subsequent cunning marriage. It is important to recognize that this abduction is, to some extent, misleading, since Zeus, the father of Kore, had already given her to Hades, and the act itself formed part of his deliberate plan. Apart from this instance, such paternal approval for a divine marriage does not appear elsewhere among the gods. The union between Hades and Kore is exceptional not only because it resembles human marriage in its course and arrangement, but also because it may be understood as a second and final form of a succession myth within traditional cosmogony, one that symbolically unites life and death. Kore stands as the last descendant in the lineage of Gaia and Uranos, reflected through the pairing of Demeter and Zeus, whose domains are the earth and the sky. In this broader cosmic sense, she may be seen as a rightful successor to Zeus. Yet Zeus' intention seems to extend beyond merely assigning her a domain. She functions as a kind of missing link that completes the cycle, for through marriage she brings together two realms and becomes queen not only of the living and the dead but also, in a sense, among the immortals. This is suggested by Hades' promise that she would rule over all that lives and moves, and would possess the greatest honors among the gods, while those who failed to honor her properly would face punishment. Even if these assurances are somewhat exaggerated in order to secure her agreement, they cannot entirely lack foundation. Kore thus plays a decisive role in the cyclical transformation of the world, a process reflected in the changing seasons, as if her return brings life back into the world she re-enters. The realm of the dead appears to have been imagined as closely resembling the world of the living, and is distinctly Greek in character, with little reference to outsiders. From early sources onward, it is described as containing gates, the palace of Hades, rivers, lakes, and trees, and is populated by various beings and deities, whose details are especially elaborated in vase painting. Hades himself is consistently portrayed as a king, a status emphasized by titles frequently attributed to him in literature, and he presides over a kind of court. Among the figures associated with this court, often mentioned only incidentally, are individuals such as the doorkeeper Aeacus, the gardener Ascalaphus, and the herdsman Menoites, along with, in later traditions, the gods' lovers and children. The earliest clear connection between Aeacus, son of Zeus and Aegina, and the underworld appears in a work where Heracles encounters him at its gates. His role as a gatekeeper and servant of Plouton, later depicted in comedy, likely preserves a memory of this tradition. Other sources describe Aeacus as having been renowned for his justice during life and, after death, as seated beside Plouton and Kore, honored above others. He is also said to have been the most pious of men, which explains both his distinguished position and his responsibility for guarding the keys of the underworld. The motif of the key is significant in representations of the ruler of the dead. The epithet keyholder, applied to Aeacus, is also at times associated with Persephone. This suggests that the rulers of the underworld may originally have been imagined as holding the keys to their own domain, while in the case of Aeacus, the possession of the key became a mark of high office and distinction. Aeacus is also linked to the role of judge of the dead, though this function is explicitly attested only in later philosophical sources, where he is said to judge the souls of Europeans. Visual representations from a later period likewise depict him in this role, although these images were likely influenced by theatrical traditions. It is therefore possible that he once appeared in such a capacity on the stage, even if direct evidence has not survived. At the same time, it is notable that earlier poetic sources, which provide extensive information about Aeacus and his lineage, do not mention any special judicial role in the underworld, suggesting that this aspect of his character may have developed at a later stage. It is true that Aeacus is described by Pindar as one who settled disputes among the gods, and he clearly possessed a reputation as a just judge already in the 5th century before Christ. Yet, based on the available evidence, it is difficult to determine which of his roles appeared first, or whether these functions coexisted from the beginning or gradually developed from one into another over time. As for Ascalaphus, the son of Acheron and Gorgera, and Menoites, the son of Kuthonamos, most information about them comes from later mythological accounts. Both figures are connected with the episode of Heracles' descent into the underworld to carry off Kerberos. In this context, Menoites appears as the herdsman of Hades. Heracles is said to have killed one of his cattle in order to provide blood for the shades, which led to a violent encounter between the two. During the struggle, Heracles crushed Menoites' torso and broke his ribs, but ultimately released him at the request of Persephone. Although this episode takes place in the realm of the dead, Menoites also appears in another tradition associated with the cattle of Hades, this time located on the island of Erythea. There, he witnesses Heracles stealing the cattle of Geryon and reports the event to their owner. Unlike Ascalaphus, Menoites can already be traced in earlier poetic tradition. Ascalaphus, by contrast, belongs clearly to a later development of the myth. His role appears to extend the narrative found in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. He is said to have testified that Persephone had eaten a pomegranate seed given to her by Plouton, thus preventing her full return. For this act, Demeter punished him by trapping him beneath a heavy stone in the underworld. When Heracles later removed the stone, Demeter transformed him into an owl. Another version of the story attributes this transformation to Persephone herself, who, angered by his revelation, changed him into a bird. The precise details remain uncertain, including to whom he revealed the truth and under what circumstances, especially since in the earlier hymn Persephone herself declares what happened when speaking to her mother. Hades does not compare to his brothers in terms of numerous love affairs, even though the abduction of Persephone stands as a central and defining example of sexual violence in Greek myth. It is difficult to imagine another story being referenced when it is said that Aphrodite once overcame even Hades. In regard to his lovers, the tradition is limited, mentioning only 2 figures. At first glance, it may seem unusual that the ruler of the dead would have lovers at all, yet these figures are not mortal women but nymphs associated with the world beneath the earth. Apart from Kore, he is not described as seducing others, but in comparison with his brothers, it would be equally surprising if he had none. The 2 nymphs linked to him are Minthe, associated with the river Cocytus, and Luk, one of the Oceanids. The tradition concerning Luk is sparse. She is described as a daughter of Oceanus and as exceptionally beautiful, which led Plouton to fall deeply in love with her and carry her off to the underworld. This account is notable because it is one of the few instances in which the god is described as experiencing affection. In contrast, nothing is said about his emotional disposition toward Kore, and their union does not appear to be driven by passion, but rather resembles a formal arrangement similar to human marriage, even if later sources sometimes interpret it differently. After Luk's death, Plouton caused her to be transformed into a white poplar in the Elysian fields, both as an expression of love and as a form of remembrance. The account suggests that she lived out her natural lifespan, and given the long lives attributed to nymphs, this would have meant a prolonged companionship. It remains uncertain whether this relationship occurred before or after his marriage to Kore, but it most likely preceded it. Kore is not mentioned in this account, and if she had already been present, Luk might have suffered the same fate as Minthe, who became a victim of her jealousy, rather than receiving a gentler transformation. Furthermore, Oceanid nymphs are presented as companions of Kore before her abduction, not as rivals. Although the daughters of Oceanus rarely appear in cult practice and generally serve genealogical purposes, Luk also displays certain explanatory features. Her very name refers to the white poplar, and later sources describe her as being associated with a tree connected to the underworld. It is said that Heracles, upon returning from the realm of the dead, fashioned a crown from its leaves. References to the use of white poplar in ritual contexts are known, for example in descriptions of participants in Bacchic rites who were crowned with fennel and white poplar. However, such evidence does not clearly establish a chthonic character for the plant, and further confirmation is lacking. The use of a related term in Homer, often interpreted as referring to the same tree, does little to clarify its significance, since it is connected to Acheron, a name that, like Achelous, can denote rivers in general. This suggests that the term may simply refer to a river tree, especially as it does not appear in descriptions of the underworld landscape, where other types of trees are mentioned instead. Another tradition relates that Heracles found the white poplar growing along the banks of a river in Thesprotia and brought it from there into Greece. According to this account, the Hellenes used its wood exclusively in sacrifices to Zeus, following Heracles' example. Even though these same people are noted for their worship of Hades, neither the god nor his realm is directly connected with this particular story. Nevertheless, the white poplar gradually acquired associations with the underworld. This may be due in part to the identification of Acheron as an underworld river, and also to the distinctive appearance of the tree itself. Its leaves display 2 different colors, which came to symbolize a connection with both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. A similar dual character is attributed to certain underworld rivers, including Styx, who is described as closely related to Luk. The color associated with the tree may also carry symbolic meaning, as it can be linked both to death and to qualities such as light, purity, and life. However, the development of these associations, as well as the emergence of Luk as a figure loved by Hades, cannot be traced with certainty. The other lover attributed to Hades, Minthe, is connected in tradition with a mountain in Pylos and with a fragrant plant. she is said to have been trampled by Kore. The sources do not clearly indicate when Min entered Hades' life, or whether she followed Luk after her death. One account suggests that she was his companion before he carried off Kore. After Kore became his wife, Min is said to have boasted of her superior beauty and claimed that Hades would return to her and dismiss his new queen. As a result, Persephone destroyed her, and Demeter reduced her to dust. Another version states that Persephone transformed her into the mint plant. It is possible that the story of Min served as a local explanation for the cult of Hades in a specific region, while the association of mint itself had a broader significance, as the plant appears among the ingredients of the ritual drink used in the Eleusinian mysteries. The myth thus reflects a connection not only between Min and Hades, but also between her and both goddesses. This narrative has attracted various interpretations. One influential approach sought to understand it through a system of oppositions, contrasting Min with Persephone and Demeter, and linking these figures to broader symbolic pairings such as concubine and wife, or different categories of plants and relationships. In this interpretation, particular emphasis was placed on certain qualities attributed to mint, including its association with desire and its supposed negative effects. However, such readings have been criticized for overlooking other aspects of the plant, including its beneficial properties, and for imposing overly rigid structures on the myth. Forbes Irving rightly observed that the association of mint with desire, or at least its sweet fragrance, fits naturally with mint's role as a lover. However, the idea that the plant signifies barrenness does not clearly apply, since both of Hades' relationships, with Kore and with Min, share similar characteristics in this respect. Moreover, Min gave her name to a particular variety of mint that is not associated with sterility, unlike another type to which such qualities have been attributed. This weakens any argument that relies on such a distinction. Likewise, mint's role in Hades' life, even if not formally recognized, cannot be meaningfully interpreted in moral terms. It is also important to note that, unlike figures who interfere in established marriages, Min did not intrude upon the union of Hades and Persephone. Rather, it was Persephone who intervened in Hades' earlier relationship with Min. The myth itself contains certain inconsistencies that have often gone unnoticed. The manner of Min's transformation is unusual when compared with similar stories, including that of Luk. Typically, such transformations are brought about by a lover, whereas in this case they are caused by a rival or by the rival's mother. Furthermore, Min's only apparent offense is her arrogant claim of superiority over Persephone, which provokes her punishment. Yet, according to broader patterns identified in myth, a verbal offense would more typically result in a different kind of transformation. It therefore appears that the version of the story preserved in some accounts may combine elements of two originally distinct traditions. One version likely concerned a local explanation for a place name and the origins of a cult, while another, more widely known, explained the origin of the plant itself. In all versions, however, the emphasis lies not so much on the transformation as on the act of destruction that precedes it. Min is torn apart or crushed. This detail may reflect the way mint releases its strongest fragrance when pressed or ground, suggesting a connection between the myth and the practical use of the plant, for example in ritual mixtures. It is difficult to determine which particular qualities of this plant led to its association with the underworld. Evidence from a later inscription indicates that it was considered unsuitable in certain ritual contexts connected with purity and pollution. The same set of prohibitions includes conditions related to birth, death, and other sources of ritual impurity, as well as restrictions on clothing, food, and sacrificial practices. Within this framework, mint appears alongside other items linked to the realm of the dead, suggesting that it was understood as connected to death and impurity, and therefore to the underworld. In a broader symbolic sense, ancient thought sometimes drew parallels between marriage and death. Certain rituals associated with weddings and funerals share similarities, and this overlap gave rise to a more complex metaphor in which death could be described as a form of union with the ruler of the dead. This idea appears in tragedy and in funerary inscriptions, where the death of a young woman is represented as a kind of marriage. In such inscriptions, figures traditionally associated with weddings are replaced by Hades, who appears as the one who claims the bride. In one example, instead of wedding deities, it is Hades who arrives in mourning attire, accompanied by a figure of vengeance. In another, he is said to have overtaken a young woman's maidenhood, while elsewhere death itself is described as a form of bridal union. These motifs, frequently found in grave epigrams, serve to soften the pain of loss by framing death within a familiar and meaningful ritual structure. The explanation for this imagery may lie in the idea that both love and death are equally powerful forces, or in the similarity of the transitions they represent, or even in the need to fulfill a ritual pattern. In tragedy, however, the association between marriage and death tends to arise more directly from the development of the narrative rather than from established commemorative tradition. A particularly significant use of this motif appears in Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris. In Iphigenia's account, she explains that she was deceived by her father, who led her to believe she was destined to marry Achilles, when in reality she was to be united with Hades. The intended bridegroom is thus revealed as the Lord of the Dead rather than the expected mortal hero. Within the play, the wedding ritual is contrasted with both funeral and sacrifice, yet it is not fully merged with them, even though the drama ultimately converges on sacrificial death. In most cases, sacrifice precedes both marriage and burial, but here all three spheres are brought into a shared horizon of meaning, since each ultimately implies death. The metaphor is constructed in a layered way, beginning with images of wedding preparations and celebrations, where song, ritual, and festivity accompany what appears to be a joyful union. This is gradually transformed into a darker vision, as Iphigenia is brought in a chariot toward what is explicitly described as a bloody wedding, an event that resembles sacrificial slaughter. In this framing, the groom is Hades, while Agamemnon assumes a role comparable to Charon, the ferryman of the dead, as suggested by the language describing the passage. The journey to Aulis, therefore, comes to resemble a descent into the underworld. Yet the entire situation is revealed to be a deception, and the metaphor is built upon the anticipation of death rather than its direct experience, expressed entirely through language that intensifies the dramatic effect of the scene. The speech is further shaped by imagery of shameful marriage rites and bloody unions, while the true purpose of the deception remains concealed until the end: sacrifice. In this sense, Iphigenia replaces the usual preliminary offerings associated with both marriage and death rituals. A similar blending of marital and deadly imagery appears in the accounts of Polyxena and Cassandra. Polyxena declares to Odysseus that she would rather dedicate her body to Hades than become a slave or concubine. She also compares herself to a calf torn from its mother, an image that can also describe a bride, but here clearly emphasizes her role as a sacrificial victim. Cassandra, another figure marked by divine misfortune, states that she will be given in marriage to a bridegroom in the house of Hades. In both tragic traditions, whether in Aeschylus or Euripides, marriage, sacrifice, and death are closely intertwined, with wedding imagery continuously transformed into funerary and sacrificial language as the narrative develops toward its climax. Cassandra refers to herself and her future husband in terms that suggest blessedness, though this carries a double meaning, since her true bridegroom is Hades. In this context, Clytemnestra takes on a role resembling a raging mother of the underworld, traditionally associated with welcoming the newly married pair into their new home. She expresses joy at opening the gates for Agamemnon's return, but in Cassandra's perception, these gates are in fact the gates of Hades. The palace itself is described as smelling like a tomb, reinforcing the sense that the scene has already shifted into a funerary space. The chorus of Furies functions as a kind of wedding procession, singing outside the bridal chamber while remaining within the palace. Cassandra, for her part, sees herself as a sacrificial victim, an offering that precedes Agamemnon's own death. This distortion of ritual forms serves to intensify the tragic irony of the events. The culmination of this imagery appears in Hecuba's lament over Polyxena, where she describes her daughter as both a bride without marriage and a virgin without virginity, lying in the marriage chamber of Hades. The transformation of the grave into a bridal chamber reaches its clearest expression in the story of Antigone, who is effectively condemned by Creon to a marriage within the house of Hades. The rocky cavern that becomes her tomb is explicitly described as the bridal chamber of the maiden and of Hades. Later it is revealed that within this space two bodies lie, and the marriage is, in a sense, completed in the underworld, where death replaces the expected union of marriage. Outside tragedy, this symbolic merging of funeral and wedding rites appears mainly in funerary inscriptions. In these contexts, the death of an unmarried girl is described as her marriage, and the grave itself is called the bridal chamber of Persephone. In some instances, even young men are described as being married to Persephone. The expression referring to the chambers of Persephone appears as a recurring metaphor for entering the underworld in both tragedy and Attic epitaphs. Such formulations suggest that the concept of the underworld itself extends beyond the grave, since the same language can refer both to burial space and to the realm of the dead. This is also reflected in tragic poetry, where chambers beneath the earth are explicitly associated with the underworld. If tomb and underworld can be treated as interchangeable, then it becomes understandable that even the dead may be invoked at their burial places. Although Persephone's own myth involves a literal encounter with Hades, in which she is taken and becomes his wife, the metaphorical description of a young woman's death as marriage to Hades is not derived directly from this myth. Instead, it arises from the blending of similar ritual elements. These include, for example, the youth of the girl emphasized through her virginity, as well as parallels between bridal veils and funeral shrouds, along with similarities in ritual actions performed in both contexts. The resemblance between the two ceremonies is striking, yet in these metaphorical uses Hades is not a bridegroom in the mythological sense. Rather, he becomes a figure representing death itself, experienced not as a deity in a narrative role, but as the embodiment of dying. This meaning becomes especially clear in passages where characters refer to someone as being married to Hades, in the sense of being destined to die. In such contexts, Hades functions as a poetic expression for death. Similarly, he is invoked as the force that ends marriages, or as the power that leads a maiden toward the shores associated with the dead, where she is described as being married to him. These expressions present Hades not as a literal partner, but as a metaphorical force associated with the irreversible separation caused by death. Within this imagery, marriage and death are closely aligned because both involve the removal of a young woman from her familiar household. A woman going to the house of Hades is therefore imagined as if she were being led into a marriage, since marriage itself also marked a transition from one household to another. This association is especially strong in the case of young, unmarried women. Although Persephone might appear to offer a parallel, she does not function as a direct model for this metaphor, since such an interpretation is not clearly supported by ancient sources. The comparison reflects literary convention rather than religious doctrine. It is also important that in Greek cult practice ordinary people do not enter into marital relations with gods. There is, in effect, only one bride of Hades, a point subtly emphasized in choral language that refers to the honor of sitting beside the bride of Hades in the afterlife. Alcestis is said to have been taken by Hades in a literal sense, yet not in order to become his wife. Another clearly recurring element in the metaphor is the emphasis on the youthfulness, or acme, of the victims of Hades, a detail also noted in ancient sources that stress how Hades takes pleasure in such victims. Clytemnestra, for instance, questions whether Hades desired to feast on her child, Iphigenia, more than on Helen, thereby presenting the god of the dead as the recipient of a sacrificial victim. In this way, the increasing despair caused by the loss of a child gains a macabre and intensified expression. Similarly, Creusa remarks that her child is growing up in the houses of Hades, even though any direct parallel with the fate of a maiden is not clearly present. In such cases, the focus of grief lies less on the child and more on the parent, since children are of particular importance to aging parents. This is made explicit in the lament of the chorus of Argive women whose sons have died at the gates of Thebes, where they declare that no one will care for them in old age because their children now belong to Hades. At first glance, the idea of offspring of Hades appears unusual, since both the god and his realm are typically associated with death rather than life. However, a less orthodox tradition, outside Homer and Hesiod, does allude to children attributed to Hades, such as the Erinyes and Zagreus. It does not seem that these figures emerged merely as late inventions preserved in later eclectic thought. Rather, traces suggest that even early traditions sometimes linked them with Hades. The earliest reference to the origins of the Erinyes appears in the Theogony, where they are described as arising from earth fertilized by the blood of Uranos after his castration by Kronos. In this tradition, they embody the curse of the crime from which they were born, namely the violence of a child against a father, a motif clearly reflected in later literary tradition. At the same time, these figures are placed in proximity to Hades and Persephone, though not as their children but as servants and agents acting on their behalf. Only in the Orphic hymns is there an explicit statement that the Erinyes are daughters of the underworld couple, described as holy daughters of great chthonic Zeus and Persephone. Yet the Orphic rhapsodies remain inconsistent, since Prodicus, in his commentary on Plato's Cratylus, refers in one instance to Persephone and Apollo, and in two others to Hades and Persephone as the parents of the Erinyes, supporting both claims with quotations. In one passage, he states that Persephone, united with Hades, gave birth to the Erinyes of the underworld, while in another she is said, through the third demiurge identified with Hades, to give birth to 9 radiant daughters associated with floral creation. These Orphic references remain isolated and are insufficient on their own to demonstrate that the Erinyes were generally understood as children of the Lord of the underworld. In tragedy, they are more often regarded as children of Nyx, although this genealogy may also result from conflation with the Keres. At the same time, Hades and Nyx are connected through their shared association with darkness, and it is therefore possible that Sophocles alludes to Hades when he describes the Erinyes as daughters of earth and darkness. The Erinyes' association with the underworld is nonetheless strong and well established, as shown by their epithets such as hateful maidens, fearful goddesses, late punishing avengers, and unnamed goddesses. They also appear in underworld settings on Apulian vases. Their connection with the realm of the dead is most clearly expressed in Aeschylus' Eumenides, where they are described as ancient old maidens, detested by both gods and mortals, who dwell in dark Tartarus beneath the earth, sharing in the pollution of evil and embodying a force rejected by both Olympians and humans. In this portrayal, the Erinyes are not only as hateful to mortals and gods as Hades himself, but also reflect a barren and unproductive aspect of the gloomy underworld. Their epithets and literary representations therefore help explain why later tradition came to regard them as offspring of Hades and Persephone. An additional perspective is offered by the observation that, while the Erinyes do not promote growth or fertility, they become active when moral pollution arises, acting as its agents and embodiments. When such pollution is absent, prosperity follows, suggesting that they represent a moral dimension of fertility in which communal flourishing depends on the observance of proper conduct. The figure of Zagreus remains obscure, since he is not represented in art and, although he appears relatively early in literary sources, the surviving passages provide little clear information about him. The earliest known reference comes from the poet of the Alcmaeones, where he is invoked together with Gaia, and both are described as the highest among all gods. Given that the poem concerns Alcmaeon, the son of Amphiaraos, the deity's association with the underworld appears particularly strong. In a fragmentarily preserved drama by Aeschylus, Sisyphus the Runaway, Zagreus is apparently identified as a son of Hades or Plouton. However, Aeschylus does not apply the name consistently, since in his Egyptians the same designation seems to refer directly to Hades himself. This inconsistency contributes to the uncertainty surrounding the figure. From Euripides' Cretans onwards, Zagreus is sometimes thought to become partially associated or syncretized with Dionysus. In the fragment, the speaker describes initiation into the rites of Idaean Zeus and refers to himself as a herdsman of night-wandering Zagreus. He also participates in feasts involving raw flesh, carries torches in honor of the Mountain Mother, and is ultimately raised to a sacred status and named Bacchus. The appearance of the name Bacchus has been taken by many scholars as evidence linking Dionysus with Zagreus, especially in combination with a reference to raw flesh rituals. However, the connection between these elements is not certain, and the lines may be interpreted independently. The identification of Zagreus with Dionysus is further supported only in a limited way by Callimachus, who refers to Dionysus as Zagreus. Yet neither Euripides nor Callimachus provides any information about the deity's parentage. Modern scholarship often connects the name with the so-called Orphic myth concerning the origin of Dionysus from Zeus and Persephone. However, the name Zagreus itself does not appear within explicitly Orphic contexts, and the reconstruction of such a myth is largely a modern scholarly construction rather than an ancient tradition. For this reason, there is no firm basis for identifying Zagreus as an Orphic form of Dionysus, or for interpreting the name as referring primarily to a chthonic aspect of the god. In early literary tradition, the name is more clearly associated either with the son of Hades or with Hades himself. Even in Callimachus, the evidence does not exclude Hades as the possible father. The etymology of the name remains uncertain, with several proposals offered but none generally accepted. The portrayal of the underworld god through myth presents him in highly anthropomorphic terms. He is shown as gaining power over the dead, entering into marriage, having relationships and offspring, and maintaining a royal household. At the same time, glimpses are offered into the structure of his realm, often giving the impression that the world of the living is extended into the domain of the dead. In most early myths, his role remains largely static. He acts more actively only in the story of the abduction of Demeter's daughter, and appears in a secondary role in myths such as the abduction of Kerberos. Nevertheless, his presence in these narratives appears natural and consistent with a broader cosmic order based on balance and alternation. From a mortal perspective, these myths are fundamental, both constitutive and explanatory in character. From an early period, the god of the underworld is closely linked with his principal domain, the earth itself, and through it with all processes of ending and coming into being. As has been observed, within mythological contexts, ruling and judging constitute two central roles attributed to Hades by the world of the living. These functions depend closely on one another and exist in a continuous relationship of mutual exchange, consequence, and reinforcement. For this reason, it is necessary to consider the god's mode of action within these spheres in order to understand expressions of his nature. The god of the shades is described by ancient authors with titles such as Lord, Ruler, and King. Although this terminology is not unexpected, since similar epithets are also used for other gods and generally reflect the relationship between mortals and immortals rather than internal divine hierarchy, what is striking is that Hades is primarily portrayed as ruling over corpses rather than souls. He is consistently the lord or king of those below, meaning the dead bodies, and he is never explicitly described as the ruler of souls. When a soul is sent to him, this action is always attributed to another agent. In contrast, Hades himself is shown as sending mortal bodies beneath the earth, while the governance of souls appears in some cases to belong instead to heroes. As far as can be determined, the earliest association of the underworld god with souls rather than corpses appears only at the end of the 4th century before the Common Era, where a funerary expression contrasts the mortal body lying in the earth with the immortal soul held by a shared guardian. This metaphor is highly unusual and otherwise unattested in connection with the god. The power of the underworld god is frequently emphasized in literature through epithets describing him as mighty, powerful, great, and strong. Paradoxically, however, these titles are usually bestowed by the living rather than the dead, even though his primary function in the myth of succession is to rule over the dead, or, more precisely, to keep the gates of his realm closed so that no one may leave and return to life. In visual representations, he is sometimes shown holding a key, and according to Pausanias, he used it to shut the underworld so that escape would be impossible. Even more significant than physical escape is the prohibition against seeing the underworld, since it is described as dreadful even for the gods. For this reason, when Poseidon shakes the earth, Hades is overcome by fear, rises from his throne, and shouts at him, warning that he might break open the surface of the earth and reveal what is concealed beneath. It may therefore be suggested that Hades embodies his own realm of destruction, or conversely, that the realm itself functions as an expression of him, since the underworld aspect is fundamentally inscribed within the god's very existence. This idea is subtly indicated in Pindar's expression, referring to a grave marker as a possession of Hades. Such grave markers, understood as egalmata, were thought to be objects in which gods take pleasure and in which their presence is reflected. This formulation also suggests the god's presence within the world of the living. On the one hand, the tomb functions as a form of cult place. On the other, human life itself can be understood as the realization of fate, since Hades is the allotment assigned to mortals, as expressed in the idea that some are granted as the share of Hades. The name of the god also appears in metaphorical descriptions of the moment of death, typically within fixed expressions such as going to the houses of Hades or passing through the gates of Hades, sometimes in shortened or elliptical forms. Other ways of referring to dying include phrases such as to be sent to Hades, to welcome Hades, or Hades receives someone. There is also evidence that the figure of Hades can be understood as death itself, even though the figure of Thanatos develops alongside him. This identification becomes especially clear in Euripides' Alcestis, where the protagonist senses that someone is approaching her. The figure then appears before her eyes as a winged Hades, dark and stern beneath his brows, while her husband Admetus does not see him. She emphasizes that Hades is already near, and that night is creeping over her vision. This scene functions as a direct representation of death, with Hades acting as death incarnate. At the same time, Thanatos also appears in the play as a distinct figure, both as a character and as the one who leads souls to the underworld and drinks the blood of the newly dead. The overlap between the two is intensified by the tragic representation of Hades as winged, a feature typically associated with Thanatos in art, even though literary sources do not consistently describe Thanatos as winged. The thanatic dimension of Hades is also visible in common expressions such as to escape Hades, which simply means to avoid death. In addition, Hades may seize a person, the allotted fate of Hades may be revealed suddenly, or one may perceive Hades as standing close to one's life. His wildness is further expressed through epithets and verbs associated with hunting, portraying him as a fierce craftsman, a grim and savage king, and a universal hunter who captures all. Literary imagery often uses the name of Hades to intensify descriptions of death, adding a macabre tone and increasing the sense of terror. As noted earlier, Clytemnestra describes Hades as having a strong desire to consume her child, thereby heightening the horror of loss. The name of the Lord of the Dead can also function adjectivally to emphasize the infernal character of an event or the murderous nature of a figure. Certain attributes of Hades and Thanatos also overlap. In one example, blood is shed with iron weapons described in association with Hades, while iron swords are also typical attributes of Thanatos in visual art. In this sense, the combined image of Hades as death corresponds closely to the Hesiodic description of Thanatos, whose heart is iron, whose spirit is unyielding bronze, and who holds fast anyone he first seizes among humans, being hated even by the immortal gods. Some physical characteristics of Hades likewise reflect his connection with death. He is described as dark, black-haired, or having deep dark hair. In early Greek usage, the term for such coloring originally meant simply dark with a kind of sheen or brightness, composed of elements such as brightness, whiteness, and dense blackness, with a sense of blue developing later in poetic tradition. This association is significant, since dark blue or dark coloring is often linked with corpses, and deities connected with the earth are regularly associated with darkness. In Euripides' Alcestis, Alcestis perceives Hades as gazing from beneath dark glimmering brows, a look that carries a clearly ominous quality. The brightness associated with vision is here reversed into darkness, so that his eyes appear sunless, like his realm, and thus symbolically dead. In contrast to this grim image, Hades is sometimes said to smile with his brows, as in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, although he is generally described as unsmiling, in keeping with the condition of the dead themselves. The passage from the hymn draws attention to the distorted and opaque nature of the god, since his internal laughter, revealed through a kind of teasing metonymy in which his eyes themselves appear to smile, expresses an ambiguous consent to Zeus' command that Kore be returned to her mother. This smile is deceptive, as it occurs precisely at the moment when Hades gives Kore the pomegranate seeds, fully aware that she will inevitably have to return to him regardless of the outcome. Grim Hades is explicitly said to have laughed only once, at the death of Tyteros, turning him into a mimic figure of the dead. Many early epithets of Hades are closely tied to his realm, presenting him as guardian of the gates, common to all receiver, ruler of many, receiver of many, hospitable to all, receiver of the dead, and tearful. These designations define his role as Lord of the Dead, while also emphasizing that he is hateful or even most hostile to mortals among all gods. Homer further combines such descriptions with terms like implacable and untamed, reinforcing the idea of a power that cannot be subdued and ultimately overwhelms everything. He is described as a chilling ruler of dark night and idle sleep, whose domain is filled with mourning and lamentation, while his companions are forgetfulness and silence. In Sophocles' ironic formulation, Hades enriches himself with groans and tears. The lamentation itself, a hateful song associated with him, is the chorus he most delights in. Even when not explicitly named as death, Hades is defined through deadly epithets such as death-bringing and murderous, which reinforce his destructive aspect. This destructive nature is made especially clear in Sophocles, where Hades is presented as a force without fairness or favor, whose sole principle is an absolute form of justice. In Aeschylus' Eumenides, the Chorus of Furies describes him as the great judge of mortals beneath the earth, who observes all actions while recording them in the tablets of his mind. This clarifies earlier claims that even if Orestes were to flee beneath the earth, he would not escape punishment, since as a polluted suppliant he remains bound, and another avenger awaits him in the darkness of the underworld. Further confirmation of Hades' role as judge appears in the Suppliants, where it is stated that those who commit wrongdoing in marriage by force will not escape punishment even after death, since another Zeus presides over a final judgment of the dead for their actions. Shortly afterwards, Pelasgos, facing the dilemma of how to respond to the Danaïdes, fears that betraying suppliants will bring upon him a god of vengeance who does not release even the dead in the underworld. Another indication, though textually uncertain, appears in a fragment of Euripides in which Atreus declares that Hades will judge these matters, even though the exact nature of what is to be judged remains unclear, whether it concerns sexual wrongdoing, seduction, or revenge. Finally, Hades' role as judge is also implied in his promise to Persephone, where he guarantees eternal vengeance upon those who commit injustice and fail to honor her with sacrifices and gifts. The assignment of the roles of judge and avenger to Hades appears, however, unusual enough to require closer consideration. According to the more traditional view found in Plato, the judges of the underworld are three in number: Rhadamanthys, Aeacus, and Minos, although the earliest clear testimony regarding their specific functions appears only at the beginning of the 4th century before the Common Era. Their selection is not surprising, since they were regarded as models of justice, and the idea of post-mortem judgment is itself older than the 5th century before the Common Era. Pindar, in the 2nd Olympian Ode, explicitly states that someone in the underworld judges sins committed in the realm of Zeus, although the identity of this figure remains uncertain. Rhadamanthys is mentioned already in Homer, and in Pindar he is associated with the Islands of the Blessed, though without being clearly designated as a judge. Aeacus, likewise in Pindar, functions as an arbitrator among the gods rather than as an underworld judge, while Isocrates refers to the honor granted to him in being placed near the gods of the netherworld. Overall, Greek thought does not present a fully coherent conception of the relationship between Hades and these underworld judges. It is possible that the idea of Hades as judge existed in informal or unreflective speech, while the triadic system of mortal judges represents a more developed mythological elaboration. Since early poets do not provide a consistent description of the structure of the underworld, it is difficult to determine to whom the judgment of souls truly belongs, and Hades is therefore not excluded from this function. In fact, he appears a plausible candidate, especially since Agamemnon's oath, in invoking those beneath the earth who punish oath-breakers, can be understood as referring to Hades and Persephone. Moreover, his judgment, as stated in Aeschylus' Suppliants, is final, so the concept of underworld justice does not conflict with the idea that Zeus enforces justice in the upper world. Instead, it may reinforce the notion of Hades as a kind of counterpart to Zeus. In this context, Dike, who sits beside her father Zeus, reports the evil intentions of humans in a fragmentary tragedy by Aeschylus. She states that she records their transgressions on Zeus' tablet and reveals them at the appointed moment of fate. Likewise, in Aeschylus' Eumenides, it is said that Hades observes all human actions and records them in the tablets of his mind. Since Dike appears to represent an aspect of Zeus' power, similar to other personified forces such as Crotus and Bia, there is no contradiction in Zeus sharing this judicial function with his underworld counterpart. Hades thus mirrors Zeus in relation to the dead, just as Zeus governs the living, making Hades, especially in tragedy, a kind of double of Zeus. As an avenger, functioning as the guardian of justice or the embodiment of retribution resulting from his judgment, Hades is twice described through the roles of avenging forces. Yet here again, as with Thanatos, it often appears that he performs functions associated with the Erinyes. He is said to send avenging ruin from beneath the earth against reckless and violent human actions, while pursuit and punishment of the damned belong to the sphere of the Erinyes. Even if they are sent by Hades and are regarded in tradition as his daughters or servants alongside Persephone, they operate as the active executive force. At the same time, the underworld itself is not typically presented as the place where the Erinyes act, since they appear more often in the world of the living. The avenging power within the underworld may therefore be understood as a materialization of abstract forces, similar to personified aspects such as Dike, Crotus, and Bia as manifestations of Zeus. In this sense, Hades represents embodied aspects of his own power. As Lord of the Dead, it would be inconsistent for him to be separated from functions naturally linked to his domain, causing death, judging the dead, punishing or avenging wrongdoing, especially in cases involving crimes against the order of his realm, such as homicide, sacrilege, perjury, or violations of moral order. A further unresolved question concerns the form of punishment in the underworld. Although references exist to great sinners beneath the earth, it is unclear who administers their punishment, and no fixed system of penalties is known. Nevertheless, Hades is never explicitly described as personally punishing mortals within his realm. The presence of the Lord of the Dead in prayers, curses, and other forms of direct address is extremely rare, especially when narrative descriptions of prayer are excluded and only explicit apostrophic invocations are considered. The surviving literary prayers directed to Hades follow a generally conventional structure and language. However, within these contexts, the two main aspects previously discussed, death and punishment, are extended by a further element connected with necromantic practice, in which he is asked to send the souls of the dead back to the world of the living. Another form of prayer addressed to the nether god is linked with agriculture, as suggested by Hesiod's instruction that farmers should pray to Zeus Thonius and sacred Demeter for good harvests before sowing and ploughing, although only indirect evidence for such practice survives. Even though the nether god is never shown actually punishing mortals within his own realm, two passages in the Iliad present a partial connection between him and punishment. In the first, Althea prays to Hades and Persephone to avenge the death of her brothers by bringing death upon the offender, and although an Erinyes is said to hear the prayer, it is not stated whether she executes it. In the second, Hades and Persephone fulfill Aminta's curse against his son Phoenix, granting his wish for childlessness, even though the original invocation was directed toward the Erinyes. The reason for the appearance of Hades, Persephone, and the Erinyes in such prayer contexts is clarified in Sophocles, where these powers are described as witnessing acts of bloodshed and adultery. Electra, in this framework, appeals to the house of Hades and Persephone, Hermes, and the Erinyes, asking them to assist in avenging her father's murder and in bringing her brother back. A similar situation appears in the Coephoroi, where Orestes and Electra both seek justice in place of injustice. Orestes first prays to Zeus, who in this context is understood as Hades, the one who sends avenging ruin from below, arguing that both parents are responsible for their actions. He then addresses the rulers of the underworld and the curses of the dead, understood as the Erinyes, asking them to observe what remains of the house of Atreus. Electra, in turn, appeals to Earth and the gods below. This is reinforced by the chorus, which states that it is a law of justice that when blood falls upon the earth, it demands further blood in return, since slaughter calls forth a fury who arises from those who died before, bringing new destruction upon destruction. In a fragment of Euripides, Cresphontes likewise appears to seek the aid of Hades in taking revenge on Polyphontes, the murderer of his father and brothers and the forced husband of his mother Merope. Notably, in all these prayers Hades is implicitly associated with punishment for both murder and adultery through death, while only in the case of Phoenix is the punishment expressed as childlessness, despite the fact that the wrongdoing was committed by his father. This may be explained by the idea that Phoenix, by pursuing the woman of his father's household, acted against his father's will. From the collected evidence, it can be concluded that Hades functions as a punitive power capable of being directed against a wide range of human transgressions. A certain inconsistency appears in the fact that he is portrayed as a guardian of marriage, even though his own marriage is traditionally sterile and therefore stands in contrast to the generative purpose of marriage in Greek thought. In addition, his union is itself founded on violence according to myth, which further complicates his association with marital order. Hades and those beneath the earth also appear in a metaphorical sense within the world of the living, since they are invoked as witnesses in the Antigone. When this is considered together with Agamemnon's oath in the Iliad, where Zeus, Helios, and those under the earth who punish oath-breakers are called upon, it becomes possible to conclude that Hades is associated with the judgment or punishment of the most serious crimes affecting the human world. At the same time, it is important to note that his punitive action is not directed at all forms of bloodshed, but specifically at violence among relatives. This is supported by Menelao's words, in which he calls on Hades as an ally and treats battlefield killings as offerings connected to Helen's recovery, even suggesting that if Hades refuses his request, the dead should be restored to life. Another category of prayer addressed to Hades concerns those who seek death as an escape from suffering. Heracles prays to Hades to end his pain through a swift-flying death, while Cassandra likewise requests death, ideally one that is quick and painless, although the precise addressee of her prayer remains uncertain. In contrast to Heracles, whose suffering is so extreme that death appears as release or healing, Cassandra, as a prophetess, fully understands the inevitability of her fate and therefore desires its immediate arrival. In some cases, such petitions for a gentle death are made on behalf of the suffering individual, as in the chorus of Oedipus at Colonus, which prays to Hades and Persephone for a painless end for Oedipus. In this context, Hades and Persephone are invoked alongside Erinyes and Thanatos. A further form of invocation appears in necromantic practice, where Hades is summoned in a different ritual context. Here the set of deities differs from those in prayers for punishment or death, since Hades is called upon together with Gaia and Hermes, rather than Persephone and the Erinyes. In these rites, he is understood as possessing the power to send the souls of the dead back into the world of the living in order to disclose truth or provide guidance, which reinforces his broader role as ruler of the dead. This pattern of raising the dead and seeking counsel appears as a recurring structure already in the Odyssey and is frequently developed in later literature, including Aeschylus' Perse, or the Persians, where the raising of Darius and its ritual language may reflect actual practices in necromantic oracles. In all these contexts, the use of different names for Hades is not primarily euphemistic in intent. It does not function simply as a way of softening the invocation of a dark deity, nor is it primarily expressed through alternative names such as Plouton, which might be expected in such usage. Instead, naming practices serve different ritual and functional purposes. A striking example appears in the Trachiniae, where Hades is described with a paradoxical epithet sweet, reinforced by the metaphor of death as eternal sleep, with sleep itself also described as sweet. Heracles accordingly prays for a metaphorical form of slumber. A more propitiatory tone is visible at the beginning of the chorus prayer in Oedipus at Colonus, where the unseen god is addressed with reverence and supplication, but the direct invocation ultimately uses the repeated vocative name of Hades. Thus, euphemism appears only in a limited and partial form. Hades, like other deities, may be approached through conciliatory epithets intended to secure favor, yet effective contact is achieved through direct naming. The choice of name in prayer is therefore determined by context and by the specific outcome desired. Although the overall impression derived from the preceding analysis of the nether god may suggest a predominantly negative character, this aspect is closely bound to his own domain, which he mirrors as his most intrinsic sphere of activity. His association with darkness and sorrow is therefore mediated through the perspective of the underworld and death. For this reason, in literary sources and funerary inscriptions, he appears mainly as a reflection of human emotions and experiences, a fact that should not be misleading. In prayers, even when they concern essentially negative matters such as death, he nevertheless emerges as a neutral power. By fulfilling petitions, he can paradoxically produce positive results, such as a form of euthanasia or the granting of justice. In many cases, he functions as an intermediary between the world of the living and the dead, enabling the living to receive benefits from the dead, including agricultural fertility, guidance, or truth. Prayers for justice further strengthen the connection between the nether god and a judicial function, suggesting at least a conceptual link between judgment and execution in his case, even though no direct narrative explicitly confirms this role. His judgment, however, is consistently represented as final. The examination of written sources shows that the portrayal of Hades remains coherent across different levels, including mythological narrative and visual representation, insofar as these can be reconstructed. He can be understood as a reversal or negative reflection of everything belonging to the upper world, functioning as an embodiment of absence or nothingness, yet still forming an essential and irreversible component of cosmic structure. One of his most distinctive features is the permeability between himself and the underworld, since the deity and his realm are inseparably connected. In early myth, his depiction is largely static. In narratives concerning the underworld, he rarely acts directly, instead appearing as a guardian of an established order, reflecting the permanence of his domain, which is unchanging, immovable, and marked by silence. Hades is also notably taciturn in Greek literature, and this silence itself represents a negation of life understood as movement, sound, and vitality. His presence in myth is therefore natural, arising from a cosmic structure based on the balance of divine powers that maintain order through alternation and harmony. Through this framework, his origins and position within both divine society and the human world become discernible. The correlation between the brothers is also reinforced through the succession myth. Hades is presented as a power equal to Zeus, and their relationship as clear counterparts mirrors the division between the world of the living and the world of the dead, which remain separate yet parallel. Their distinction is visible primarily in the realms they govern, but also in their nature. Zeus is a god of transformation and shifting forms, whereas Hades is defined by constancy. The only major exception to this parallel structure appears along the axis Zeus, Earth, Hades in the myth of the Abduction of Kerberos, where all three divine powers participate. The seizure of Demeter's daughter is, in fact, the only episode in which Hades acts directly within the world of the living, marking his sole explicit intervention outside his realm and creating a symbolic link between life and death. The myth of Heracles' descent to capture Kerberos, the most frequently mentioned narrative connected with the underworld, is usually interpreted as highlighting Heracles' heroic achievement rather than focusing on the Lord of the Dead. Nevertheless, it implicitly reveals key aspects of Hades' role as ruler and judge of the dead, particularly his function in guarding the boundary between worlds, a boundary that must remain intact to preserve cosmic order. These functions are attributed to him through an intuitive association and remain closely interconnected. Hades both embodies his realm of death and is simultaneously manifested through it, since the underworld is inscribed in his very existence through shared epithets, modes of being such as invisibility, and fixed formulae like the houses of Hades, which stand in contrast to expressions associated with the world of the living. He is thus depicted as an unyielding, cold, and dark lord of lifeless bodies who receives all alike, and as a punitive force applicable to a wide range of transgressions, especially serious violations of the human order such as kinslaying, adultery, and perjury. The presence of the Lord of the Dead in prayers, curses, necromantic rituals, and other forms of direct invocation is extremely limited. When it does occur, it is primarily associated with personal petitions for a swift death, for punishment of the living or the dead, or for the summoning of souls from the underworld to reveal hidden knowledge. Euphemistic strategies in these contexts are only partially and inconsistently present, since although Hades, like other deities, must be made favorable through propitiatory epithets, effective contact is achieved only through direct invocation of his proper name. The choice of name in such prayers depends on context and desired outcome, and in the case of Hades these names refer more to his primary nature than to softened or euphemistic alternatives. The Lord of the Underworld appears in ancient imagination primarily through opposition, being linked on multiple levels both with abstract concepts and with other divine figures. This is especially evident in his frequent comparison with Zeus and Aphrodite. He mirrors Zeus as a supreme power, though one governing the dead, and parallels Aphrodite in the inevitability of his influence upon the living, just as Thanatos stands opposed to Eros. This relationship between Hades, Zeus, and Aphrodite is also reflected in their associated instruments or personified forces, such as Dike, Crotus, and Bia in the case of Zeus, Dike, Thanatos, and the Erinyes in the case of Hades, and Eros, Pothos, Himeros, and Pytho in the case of Aphrodite, which express different aspects of their divine nature by elevating abstract qualities into active powers. Aphrodite is particularly significant in this respect, since apart from Hades, no other deity embodies abstraction so fully or possesses such a multiplicity of personified forces, nor exerts such comprehensive influence over human life, the senses, and metaphorical existence. These overlaps between Hades and other gods arise from the blurred and difficult nature of his form, which is hard to define because it belongs to a sphere beyond human experience. Only within mythological tradition, especially of a secondary and etiological kind, does the Lord of the Dead acquire more human-like traits, including the attribution of passions. For this reason, a major inconsistency appears in the depiction of the underworld. Although it is generally said to be terrible even for gods to behold and unpleasant for humans to enter even in dreams, it is nevertheless also presented as containing marvels familiar from the world of the living, with elaborate landscapes. Hades himself, together with his palace, court, servants, and the presence of the dead, appears in some accounts to extend the structures of earthly life beyond death. This image is, however, misleading, since it is primarily accessible through literary sources where it is shaped by specific contexts and particular conceptions of the underworld, often of a literary nature. Hades is scarcely present in funerary inscriptions. The variety of descriptions found in different sources reflects a distinctly human curiosity that, unable to fully comprehend what lies beyond, constructs it through detailed imaginative elements, including elaborate depictions of palaces in Apulian pottery. These seemingly minor details in fact reveal the needs and desires of the living, as well as their attempt to familiarize themselves with what is unknown or beyond perception. No other deity in Greek thought is provided with such a detailed dwelling as Hades. Even when this setting appears unusual or unexpected, the very presence of such detail remains significant and should not be disregarded. The rarity of references to Hades, under any of his names, in Greek thought raises a further question concerning the nature of belief in the afterlife and the extent to which his figure was central to it. Two explanations are possible. Either his absence suggests that he was not part of the most widespread conception of the afterlife, if such a unified conception existed at all, or it indicates a limited belief in life after death, or even its absence altogether. It should be emphasized that in all surviving accounts of the Lord of the Dead and the Underworld, the material is primarily literary rather than religious in nature. There is, for example, no known prayer offered to him on behalf of the dead, which may suggest a lack of belief that such an act could be effective, or even uncertainty about the existence of an afterlife itself. Prayers to Hades are made only by the living. It appears that human perception ends with Hades, since he embodies non-existence itself, and thus marks the boundary of what can be experienced or imagined. Unlike the other gods of the Greek pantheon, he is not shaped in human form or likeness. Instead, he represents everything that lies beyond the human condition. Any anthropomorphic traits attributed to him arise from literary context or from attempts to describe what cannot be experienced directly, which is why his image remains incomplete, unspoken, and only partially outlined. His presence within the world of the living is associated with isolation, hostility, irreversibility, and a wild, untamed quality, yet it also carries elements of fascination and mystery that stimulate imagination. In this sense, his literary portrayal reflects a broader paradox within Greek conceptions of divinity, which may be expressed, as Orestes says, in the idea that the gods are no more real than elusive dreams. In the Scholium commenting on the passage concerning the succession myth in the 15th book of the Iliad, the scholiast explains that the name Hades, understood as a designation of Hades, is derived from the verb meaning I breathe, since it is said to hold together souls, conceived as wind, and at the same time to be connected with respiration and the growth of crops, from which human beings draw breath. For this reason, the god is also called Zeus of the underworld because he generates life, and Plouton because he provides wealth. Other interpretations derive the name from invisibility or from the idea that he renders others invisible. Although this is an allegorical attempt to explain the meanings of different names of the nether god, the interpretation appears to be based on properties embedded in the supposed etymologies of those names. The explanation is structured around two opposing categories: a functional one related to giving life, and a perceptual one related to invisibility, both of which find some reflection in the nature of the god. The names therefore seem to indicate specific aspects of his character. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the nether god is described as polyonymos, meaning known under many names or worshipped under many names. However, for the purpose of this video, we will explore meaning and symbolism associated with two of the most famous among these names, which are Hades and Plouton. Scholarship often maintains that chthonic deities were addressed through euphemistic substitutes rather than direct names, particularly in cult practice, in order to make contact with dangerous divine powers more acceptable. Hades is the oldest attested name of the nether god, used in both literary and epigraphic contexts connected with the underworld, and it likely shaped ancient Greek conceptions of the deity as well as modern assumptions about him. However, this name appears in cult practice only outside Elis, at least according to Pausanias, the sole source for this information. Both ancient and modern etymological interpretations explain the name Hades in a similar way, deriving it from the notion of invisibility, either as the unseen or as the one who makes things invisible. This interpretation is supported by a funerary inscription from Larissa, where a digamma is preserved in the spelling of the name. Funerary epigraphy also reflects this idea in a passive sense, since the dead are described as invisible, and the underworld itself is associated with invisibility in literary language through similar expressions. The earliest literary indication of this meaning appears in Sophocles, who plays etymologically with the name of Hades through descriptive epithets that emphasize what is unseen and turned away. In this perspective, turning away, as represented for example on a black figure cup from Volsai, carries an anthropological and symbolic meaning of withdrawal from the world. This gesture, similar to the closed eyes found on funerary stelae, expresses a separation from the living that is not necessarily intentional but follows naturally from the condition of the dead, who no longer interact with the living. This idea can be extended further. If the underworld functions as a reflection of the world of the living, then turning away symbolically anticipates the appropriate orientation both for the living when approaching the realm of the dead and for the dead themselves in relation to the other world. The motif of averted eyes also appears in sacrificial and supplicatory contexts involving underworld powers. A prominent example is found in the Odyssey, where Circe instructs Odysseus to perform a ritual sacrifice by turning toward Erebos while averting himself from the stream of the river. The notion of invisibility associated with Hades is further reflected in his cap, the helmet of invisibility made for him by the Cyclopes, which grants invisibility to its wearer. In surviving literary sources, it is used 3 times, first by Athena in an attempt to deceive Ares, then by Perseus in order to obtain the head of Medusa, and finally by Hermes during the battle between the gods and the giants. None of these accounts describes Hades himself using the helmet to conceal his actions or presence. This may be because he does not require it in order to act unseen in the world of the living, while within his own realm its use would be unnecessary. In fact, no god requires it for such purposes. It appears that only the immortals need this object, since they are not naturally invisible to one another. Paradoxically, those who are invisible to the visible world cannot be invisible among themselves. This idea is confirmed in scholia to the Iliad, which describe the helmet of Hades as a mist through which the gods become invisible to each other. In all instances, the cap can be understood as a power of Hades, in the sense that it renders the wearer invisible by using the god's own defining property. It appears that no one other than Hades possesses such a capacity, which suggests that his fundamental power in Greek thought is directed toward making things invisible by transferring his own condition onto them. This is consistent with the invisibility attributed both to the dead and to the underworld itself. This is emphasized by Hesiod, who states that the cap contains within itself the dread darkness of night, an expression that already implies invisibility. The term Zophos is frequently used to describe the realm of the dead, and Hades is described as having received the misty darkness as his allotted domain. Darkness, in this conceptual field, is closely linked with invisibility. Moreover, destruction by Hades is most starkly expressed through metaphors in which darkness covers or overwhelms the eyes, where darkness is effectively equivalent to death itself. A typical example is the phrase in which darkness covers the eyes. A funerary inscription also describes this idea through the image of the dark wings of Hades cast over the deceased. According to Hesychius, terms such as darkness, destruction, death, Erebus, Zophos, and night share synonymous meanings, which reflects a conceptual system grounded in the absence of light, since without light nothing can be seen. The absence of light is therefore equivalent to the absence of life, a connection reinforced in the Odyssey, where Helios threatens to descend to the underworld to shine among the dead if his cattle are not avenged. It is therefore not accidental that literary descriptions of Hades often focus on his eyes, which are portrayed as gleaming with darkness. In Greek thought, perception is strongly centered on vision, and life itself is associated with seeing. Even linguistic evidence reflects this association, since the word for man is etymologically linked with light, and eyes can be described as lights. Hades is effectively manifested through vision, and this is how Alcestis recognizes him as she is dying, when she sees a winged Hades with dark eyebrows leading her away to the realm of the dead. Significantly, she perceives him only at the moment of death, when darkness already overtakes her sight, which indicates that he remains invisible to the living but not to the dead. She even questions whether Admetus can see what she sees. Similarly, in Sophocles' Philoctetes, the chorus describes the one who lies with Hades as stretched out in darkness and deprived of sight. The darkness of Hades beneath the earth is said to be so unpleasant that mortals dread it even in dreams, since what lies below is understood as nothingness, and the dead are themselves nothing. Hades covers what is visible in the world of the living, rendering it invisible and effectively annihilating it. His destructive force is compared to a wave that falls equally upon both the unsuspecting and the prepared, acting without distinction or reversal. This imagery of the wave corresponds to the function of the cap as a covering force that renders beings invisible, especially those who no longer belong to the world of the living, namely the dead. All the contexts and references considered here clearly define Hades' essential attribute as invisibility. It is highly likely that Hades originally functioned, at least in part, as an abstract principle that gradually became identified with invisibility itself, and found embodiment in the state of death and everything associated with it, as though all that is unseen belonged to him. For this reason, the question of when the name Hades began to refer either to the god or to the place of the dead, as well as which meaning was primary, is not strictly meaningful, since such distinctions were probably not operative in Greek thought itself. Hades appears rather as a metonymic presence, similar to other primordial figures of the Greek pantheon such as ocean, sky, night, Styx, Tartarus, Erebus, and Earth, which function simultaneously as both deities and realms. In such cases, the characteristics of the god and the domain develop together and remain closely interconnected. In De Natura Deorum, Cicero states that the whole abundance and substance of the earth is attributed to Father Dis, whose name is connected with rich, in the same way as Plouton among the Greeks. This is because all things return into the earth and also arise from it. In a similar vein, Plato seeks the meaning of Plouton in the act of giving Plutos, explaining that the god receives this name because wealth is sent upward from beneath the earth. The association between Plouton and Plutos is linguistically well established. Plouton should therefore be understood as a god of wealth rather than being identified with Plutos, who is the son of Demeter and Iasion, conceived in a thrice-ploughed field and blinded by Zeus. The two figures are connected only on an abstract level, where Plutos functions as a personification, while Plouton represents the ruler or dispenser of richness in all its forms. Although ancient authors occasionally treat the names as interchangeable in poetic wordplay, as in Aristophanes' Wealth, this remains a literary construction rather than a conceptual identity. The idea of Plouton as giver of wealth is further reinforced by the epithet Plutodotes, meaning giver of riches, which appears once as a proper designation on a fragment of an Athenian red figure Skyphos from Eleusis. Plouton appears to lack a developed mythological narrative altogether, and nothing is known about his origin. This absence of mythic biography is often taken as an argument that Plouton and Hades are in fact the same deity. His connection with the underworld is confirmed by elements usually associated with Hades, including Kerberos, Persephone, the realm of the dead, and his share in the division of the world. In addition, Plouton is not attested in ancient literature before Sophocles' Antigone, where he is not depicted as a benevolent figure, but as one whose anger must be appeased through prayer. Pausanias also notes an image of Plouton in the temple of the Semnai Theai at Athens, suggesting that the god and his representation were regarded as fearsome. Despite this, the absence of earlier references to Plouton remains difficult to explain. It may be accidental, as Nielsen suggested, or it may reflect a specifically Attic origin of the name. The name itself is formed with a highly productive suffix commonly found in proper names, nicknames, and epithets derived from nouns or adjectives, and such formations are especially characteristic of Attic usage. Plouton is indeed primarily attested in Attica. The earliest literary and epigraphic evidence comes from Athens, and there are no clear attestations outside this region until at least the 3rd century before Christ. This is significant given that tragedy and comedy of 5th century Athens, the earliest major Attic literary genres, already employ the name. The Attic dialect itself remained relatively obscure before this period, which strengthens the possibility that Plouton was originally an Attic designation for the nether god that entered broader literature with the rise of Attic cultural influence and the spread of associated cults. The meaning of the name is clearly linked to wealth and abundance in a broad sense, which is reflected in the cornucopia as the god's primary attribute in art, appearing for the first time in Greek visual tradition specifically as an attribute of the underworld deity. Hesychius' observation that Plutos originally referred to wealth in grain further clarifies the agricultural and vegetative associations embedded in the name. By contrast, Plouton's supposed connection with mines is secondary and appears mainly in humorous contexts. Only 2 instances suggest a more serious interpretation, neither of which directly refers to mines. In one case, Aeschylus applies the name to a mythical river flowing with gold, and in another, an Athenian funerary inscription seems to use the expression common steward in reference to him. The naming of a river Plouton to express its richness parallels the case of the mythical river Hades, where the name reflects the property of disappearance. Aristophanes states in a playful manner that Plouton would never have received this name if he had not obtained the best of everything. In Sophocles, however, another possible route for understanding the formation of the name appears, expressed through a sarcastic remark in which Hades is said to become enriched through sighs and laments. The emphasis here is on the god himself becoming richer, not on enriching others, which may conceal an important clue for understanding Plouton as a counterpart of Hades, who is described as not giving. This does not suggest that Plouton is the one who gives, a role more properly associated with Plutodotes, but rather that he is the rich one, whose defining property is wealth itself, and who may grant it only when favorably disposed. This idea is also echoed in Socrates' explanation of the name, where it is suggested that many things are present with him in abundance in the underworld. A similar notion appears in Hesiod's cosmogonic vision, where the depths of the earth contain the roots, beginnings, and limits of all things. For this reason, prayers are directed to the dead, asking them to send blessings upward, since wealth is understood as something that rises from beneath the earth. In this light, the meaning of the name is clearly linked to the goods hidden within the earth, rather than primarily to any active generosity toward the living, which appears to be a later development associated especially with Eleusinian tradition. Socrates' explanation of the name also indirectly points in this direction. Although Plouton is the name of the nether god most frequently used in cult contexts, including curse tablets, it is noteworthy that it is especially prominent in association with the two goddesses, and that its broader popularity is largely due to this connection. In Athens, Plouton appears mainly in relation to the Thesmophoria, where he had a priestess, and he was probably also a recipient of sacrifice during the Procharisteria. Both festivals were connected with agricultural fertility and the productivity of the earth. In addition, Plouton seems to have had an indirect role within the Eleusinian promise as well. The prominence of Plouton has led some scholars to argue that the character of Hades had to change, and that his darker aspect was eventually suppressed, since no one worships death. However, Plouton is not the only form in which the nether god appears in Eleusinian contexts, since he is also represented through the figure of Theos, a designation for disguised Hades. Although the name Hades itself rarely appears in cult practice and is absent from Attic ritual contexts, a similar pattern can be observed in the case of Persephone. Moreover, Plouton and Theos appear to function in parallel within Eleusinian religion, in the same way that Demeter's gifts to humanity carry equal importance, namely food in the form of grain and hope for a better fate after death. It therefore seems that, although Plouton may still be understood as a euphemistic designation of the god, greater emphasis should be placed on its metonymic rather than purely substitutive character. The name does not avoid Hades, but instead selects a specific aspect of the deity, as if referring to one particular sphere of divine power. The meanings of these names are clear, and they reveal two complementary aspects of a single deity engaged in a cycle of exchange and shared properties. They remain fundamentally the same god, sharing the domain of the underworld, mythological traits, and appearing in funerary inscriptions and curse texts, while functionally relating to different aspects of human life. Whether the change of name also corresponds to a change in the god's properties is a separate issue. A similar situation can be observed with Persephone, whose alternative name Kore does not appear coincidentally. Through her marriage to Hades, Kore becomes Persephone, queen of the dead, a transformation already indicated in the marital promise within the Homeric hymn to Demeter. She also shares with Hades the property of invisibility, expressed through an epithet meaning unseen, which reflects the fundamental aspect of the ruler of the dead. When associated with Hades, she is also given an epithet emphasizing her formidable and fearsome nature. The Lord of the Netherworld is often regarded by scholars as having had no cult among the ancient Greeks. This view is not surprising, especially in light of Aeschylus' statement that no one worships death. However, as has already been shown, such a claim, even if it reflects a general opinion, cannot be accepted as strictly accurate in the light of archaeological discoveries and the analysis of surviving evidence. Moreover, it would be difficult to account for the later Roman cult of Dispater without assuming some earlier Greek cultic background connected with Hades. The main issue at this stage concerns the cultic status and role of the nether god within Greek belief, a problem complicated by his multiple names. As argued previously, these names appear to indicate distinct aspects of the deity, rather than functioning merely as euphemistic substitutes. It is therefore necessary to examine the relationship between cult contexts and divine names through archaeological and other forms of attestation. Traces of prayers directed to Hades in literary sources, together with his presence in ancient visual culture, including statues and votive reliefs in various settings, allow a preliminary reconstruction of his spheres of activity. These include power or rule, earth and fertility, oracular and necromantic practices involving the raising of the dead, the realm of the dead itself, marriage, and justice. His appearance in such contexts is not accidental, and in each case appears to be meaningfully grounded. It may also be significant that he is depicted in scenes associated with birth or death, such as on the lost Amyclean throne or on the bas-relief of the statue of Athena Parthenos. Although the evidence remains complex and at times unclear, it is sufficiently important to merit further attention and investigation. The only place where Hades appears to have had an independent cult is Elis, and, if Pausanias is to be trusted, the Hellenes were the only Greeks who worshipped him. According to a local tradition recorded by Pausanias, the origin of this cult was linked to Heracles' attack on Pylos in Elis, where Hades was honored. Because of his hostility toward Heracles, Hades is said to have taken part in the defense of the Pylians against the attacker. As support for this tradition, the Pylians reportedly cited verses from the Iliad describing Hades being wounded by Heracles at Pylos among the dead. Whether this etiological narrative truly demonstrates the antiquity of Hades' cult in Elis remains uncertain, especially given the lack of archaeological confirmation. The myth itself, however, appears to belong to an older layer of the Heracles tradition, possibly predating Homer, since Clement of Alexandria reports, on the basis of Homer and Panyasis, that Hades was struck by Heracles, and that in Elean tradition this figure is identified with Hades, assuming the necessary textual correction in the transmitted form. Although Pausanias refers to a sacred precinct and temple of Hades in Elis, some scholars argue that he may in fact be referring to Pylos in Tryphilia, where Strabo mentions a sanctuary of Hades located at the foot of Mount Minde. Pausanias introduces the information about the Temple of Hades somewhat abruptly after describing sanctuaries of Aphrodite in the Elean Agora, and does not specify its exact location, which is unusual for his method, and creates the impression of a lack of connection between the passages. For this reason, it has been suggested that the myth concerning Hades' lover in Strabo's account, who gave her name to the nearby mountain in Pylos, together with the presence of a sanctuary of Hades and a grove of Demeter in the same area, would provide a more coherent etiology for the cult attributed to Elis. Nevertheless, there is no archaeological evidence confirming the existence of such a cult in either location. The information provided by Strabo does not correspond fully with the account given by Pausanias. In Strabo's version, in Tryphilian Pylos Hades had a sacred precinct situated near the mountain, and above the Pylian plain there was a grove dedicated to Demeter. By contrast, Pausanias speaks specifically of a sacred enclosure and a temple of Hades. In addition, Pausanias does not mention any other deities located near the temple, which makes it reasonable to distinguish between the two descriptions of the cult tradition. Pausanias further states that the Hellenes established a temple for Hades because he was favorable to them and hostile to Heracles. However, only a few lines earlier, he reports that Hades came to assist the Pylians in their struggle against Heracles because he was already honored in Pylos. It therefore appears that Hades possessed a sacred precinct in both Elis and Pylos, while the temple in Elis may have been granted to him as an additional honor after his conflict with the hero. Nothing is known about the nature of his sanctuary in Elean Pylos. Yet, in the absence of archaeological evidence, any attempt to harmonize Pausanias' account remains hypothetical. At most, if it is accepted that Hades also had cultic presence in Elis itself, then the descriptions of temples, locations, and the origin of the cult do not necessarily contradict one another. Moreover, Pausanias elsewhere suggests that Hades was worshipped across the broader Elean territory, possibly in several of its communities. The nature of Hades' cult in Elis or Pylos remains unclear and difficult to define, largely due to the brevity of Pausanias' account. The etiological narrative involving Heracles appears secondary and offers limited insight. The most important piece of information is that Hades already received honors in Pylos before the conflict with the hero. Pausanias also reports that the temple in Elis was opened only once a year, and that only the priest was permitted to enter it. The stated reason for this rare opening is that the Hellenes wished to mark the idea that human beings descend into Hades only once. No further details are provided regarding the season, the time of day, or the precise nature of this cult practice, which appears to have had a near-mystery character. Nevertheless, some tentative conclusions can be drawn from Pausanias' testimony. If the explanation for the temple's opening is taken seriously, the cult appears to be associated with death or fate in general, although there is no explicit indication that it involved the cult of the dead. Moreover, if the annual opening is symbolically linked to the end of human life, and if the year can be metaphorically compared to a human lifespan with its beginning and end, then it is reasonable to associate this ritual moment with the final month of the year. It is noteworthy that even Plato places the month of Plouton as the last in the calendar in his laws. Overall, the evidence suggests that Hades did have an individual cult in Eleusis, and that it was primarily connected with his central sphere of activity, namely death. The cult of Hades reported by Strabo appears to be linked with the myth concerning the destruction of Min, his lover. As noted in the discussion of this myth, the local tradition most likely related this story to the naming of the mountain and to the origins of Hades' cult, while a more widespread version explained it through the plant itself, Hedyosmus, and its use as an ingredient, for example in the Eleusinian Kykion. The evidence regarding the cult provided by Strabo is limited and fragmentary, consisting mainly of topographical information and brief elements of the etiological myth. According to the geographer, Hades possessed a sacred precinct at the base of the mountain known as Min, located near Pylos in Tryphilia, towards the east. He also mentions a grove situated near the same mountain, dedicated to Demeter, positioned above the Pylian plain, which he emphasizes as fertile. The cult in Pylos seems to involve additional divine figures, especially Demeter and Persephone, yet the fate of Min suggests an underlying connection with death. At the same time, the fertility of the surrounding plain directs attention towards cult practices associated with vegetation and agricultural growth. Of particular importance is Strabo's focus on Hades himself. He does not record any festival or specific ritual activity beyond worship connected with his cult in this area. However, he adds a significant detail, namely that the Mecistians in the northern region also honored him. This information appears immediately after the mention of the sacred precinct, while no comparable details are given for Demeter or Persephone. Further in his description of northern Tryphilia, Strabo notes that two rivers flow into the Alpheos, Dalion and Acheron. The latter is said to have been named because of its close association with Hades. In this region, not only the sanctuaries of Demeter and Kore, but also those of Hades were held in especially high honor. Strabo concludes this section by suggesting that the worship of Hades may be explained through oppositions, since the land of Tryphilia is both highly fertile and yet also produces mildew in grain and reeds, resulting in frequent alternation between abundance and complete crop failure. It therefore seems that the cult of Hades was connected with agricultural productivity, or more precisely with the prevention of crop failure and the safeguarding of growth, an idea that recalls Hesiodic references in the Works and Days. In this sense, Demeter appears responsible for the growth of crops, while Hades is associated with their protection or continuation. At the same time, the landscape itself evokes certain qualities of the underworld, being damp, mouldy, and prone to decay.